Welcome back to Let's Get Weird in the Dark. Tonight, we're traveling to one of the most remote and inhospitable places in the British Isles. A cluster of rocky islands 20 miles off the western coast of Scotland. Islands with no inhabitants. No trees. No shelter from the Atlantic storms that hammer them relentlessly. The Flannan Isles. Also known as the Seven Hunters. A place sailors feared. A place of legends and warnings. A place where, in December of 1900, 3 men vanished without a trace, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. This is the story of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. And the keepers who disappeared. Close your eyes. Settle in. Let's explore what happened on that remote rock, and why, over a century later, we still don't know the answer. The Flannan Isles sit in the Outer Hebrides, about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis. They're not one island but a small archipelago. 7 main islands and numerous smaller rocks and skerries. The largest island, Eilean Moor, is barely a quarter-mile across. No one lives there. No one ever has, really, except for occasional shepherds who would bring sheep to graze in summer months. The islands are too remote, too exposed, too brutal for permanent habitation. The Atlantic Ocean pounds them constantly. Waves can reach heights of 50 feet or more during winter storms. The wind never stops. There's no natural harbor. No safe landing. Approaching the islands by boat is dangerous even in calm weather. The name Flannan comes from Saint Flannan, a 7th century Irish bishop. There's a small ruined chapel on Eilean Moor, supposedly built by him or his followers. Local legends claimed the islands were sacred. That supernatural forces protected them. That disturbing them would bring misfortune. Fishermen avoided the area. Shepherds who visited the islands reported strange feelings. An atmosphere of wrongness. A sense of being watched. Stories passed down through generations warned that the Flannan Isles were not a place for men. But by the late 1800s, Britain needed a lighthouse there. Too many ships were wrecking on the rocks. The route past the Hebrides was heavily trafficked, and the Flannan Isles sat right in the shipping lanes, invisible in fog and darkness. Construction began in 1895. It was a massive undertaking. Every stone, every piece of equipment, every supply had to be brought by boat to islands where landing was treacherous. Workers could only work during brief periods of calm weather. Storms would halt construction for weeks at a time. The lighthouse keeper's principal assistant, Robert Muirhead, oversaw the construction. He later reported that workers were uneasy about the place. Several refused to return after their first visit. They complained of strange sounds at night. Of feeling watched. Of an oppressive atmosphere that made them want to leave. Muirhead dismissed these concerns as superstition. The lighthouse was vital for maritime safety. It would be built regardless of local legends. The lighthouse was completed in December 1899. A magnificent structure. 75 feet tall. Built of brick and stone. With a light visible for 24 miles. It stood on the highest point of Eilean Moor, 150 feet above sea level. The lighthouse required 3 keepers. They would work in rotation. 2 keepers would always be on the island while one was ashore on leave. Every 2 weeks, a relief boat would arrive to swap crews and deliver supplies. The keepers' quarters were built into the base of the lighthouse. Compact but adequate. Sleeping rooms. A kitchen. A storage area. Everything needed for men to live in isolation for weeks at a time. The lighthouse was officially lit on December 7, 1899. For a year, it operated normally. Keepers rotated on schedule. Supplies were delivered. Reports were filed. Everything functioned as designed. And then, in December 1900, something happened. 3 men were stationed at Flannan Isles Lighthouse in December 1900. James Duckett was the principal keeper. Age 43. Experienced and reliable. He'd been a lighthouse keeper for years, serving at multiple stations. Married with 4 children. A steady, competent man. Not given to flights of fancy or panic. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant. Age 28. Also experienced, though younger than Duckett. He'd worked at several lighthouses and had an excellent service record. Calm under pressure. Physically strong. Well suited to the demanding work. Donald MacArthur was the third keeper, the occasional assistant. He was supposed to be on duty that December, but he'd fallen ill just before the rotation. A replacement was needed quickly. William MacArthur took his place. Age 40. Less experienced than the others, but trained and capable. He'd worked as an assistant keeper for several years. This was his first posting to Flannan Isles. So the crew that December consisted of Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur. 3 men. Alone on a rock in the Atlantic. 20 miles from the nearest land. The relief keeper who should have been ashore on leave was Joseph Moore. He was scheduled to return to the island on December 20th with the relief vessel Hesperus. He'd swap places with one of the keepers and spend the next 2 weeks on the island. Moore would be the one to discover what had happened. The last confirmed contact with the lighthouse was December 15, 1900. On that date, the steamer Arch tore past the Flannan Isles during a severe storm. The captain noted in his log that the lighthouse was dark. No light was visible. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes in extreme weather, keepers would temporarily extinguish the light if it was in danger of being damaged. The captain reported the dark lighthouse when he reached port, but it wasn't considered urgent. Storms sometimes disrupted operations. The keepers would sort it out and file a report with the next relief vessel. What the captain didn't know was that December 15th was the last day anyone would see the keepers alive. Or rather, it was probably the last day. No one knows for certain when they disappeared. December 15th is an estimate based on later evidence. The actual date might have been earlier. Or later. No one knows. The lighthouse log, which keepers were required to maintain daily, would later provide some clues. But the log itself would raise more questions than it answered. December 20th, 1900. The relief vessel Hesperus approached Flannan Isles. The weather had been terrible for over a week. Winter storms had battered the Scottish coast. The Hesperus had been delayed by rough seas. Captain Harvey had tried to reach the islands on December 18th but couldn't land safely. He'd sailed close enough to see the lighthouse, but no one came down to the landing area. No flag was raised to signal the keepers. This was odd. Keepers were always eager for relief. They'd be watching for the boat. They'd be ready to unload supplies and exchange crew. Harvey sounded the ship's horn. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. He couldn't land in those conditions. The seas were too rough. He'd have to return when weather permitted. On December 20th, the weather improved slightly. Harvey approached again. The lighthouse was visible. The light had been operating, he'd seen it during the night. So the keepers must be there. They must be maintaining the light. But again, no one came down to meet the boat. No flag. No signal. Nothing. Harvey sounded the horn repeatedly. Fired a flare. No response. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who was supposed to return to the island, stood on deck watching. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The keepers should be responding. They should be desperate for supplies. They should be visible. Harvey made the decision. They had to land. They had to investigate. Something had happened. The Hesperus maneuvered as close to the landing area as Captain Harvey dared. A small boat was lowered. Joseph Moore and 2 crew members climbed in. They rowed toward the landing platform. The sea was still rough. The small boat rose and fell on the swells. Spray soaked them. The rocks loomed dark and forbidding. They reached the landing platform. The iron railings. The stone steps leading up to the lighthouse. Everything looked normal. No visible damage. No signs of disaster. Moore climbed out. He called out. His voice echoed off the rocks. No answer. He started up the path toward the lighthouse. The 2 crewmen followed. The wind howled. The sea crashed against the rocks below. Moore reached the lighthouse compound. The gate was closed but not locked. He opened it and walked through. The lighthouse door was closed. Locked from outside, which was the normal procedure when going out to work. Moore had a key. His hand shook slightly as he unlocked the door. He pushed it open. Called out again. Hello? Anyone here? Silence. Just the wind and the distant sound of waves. Moore stepped inside. The 2 crewmen hesitated at the doorway, then followed. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The lighthouse was empty. 3 men had vanished. But the state of the lighthouse, the clues left behind, the evidence of what might have happened, that's where the mystery really begins. In the next segment, we'll walk through what Joseph Moore found. The details that made sense. The details that didn't. The evidence that suggested a rational explanation. And the evidence that suggested something far stranger. Joseph Moore stepped into the lighthouse. The entrance hall was dark. He called out again. His voice echoed in the empty space. No response. He moved through the ground floor. Everything looked normal at first glance. Neat. Orderly. The way a properly maintained lighthouse should look. But something was off. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the stove was cold, long dead. Ashes sat undisturbed in the grate. Moore climbed the stairs to the living quarters. The 2 crewmen from the Hesperus followed close behind. The kitchen. The table was set for a meal. Not eaten, just set. Chairs pushed back from the table. A half-eaten meal sitting on the counter, covered with a cloth. Everything positioned as if the keepers had been interrupted mid-task. The sleeping quarters. 2 of the beds were made. 1 was unmade, as if someone had gotten up and not yet tidied it. Personal belongings were in place. Clothes hanging on pegs. Books on shelves. Everything where it should be. Moore continued upstairs to the light room at the top. The lamp itself was clean, maintained, ready to be lit. But it was cold. It hadn't been lit recently. The mechanism was wound, but not operating. Moore came back down. He checked the storage areas. Supplies were present. Food. Fuel. Water. Everything needed to sustain 3 men for weeks. The logbook was in its proper place in the duty room. Moore picked it up and opened it. The logbook was where keepers recorded their daily activities, weather conditions, maintenance performed, any unusual events. It was required to be updated daily without fail. Moore flipped through the pages. Entries up to December 13th were normal. Weather reports. Routine maintenance notes. Nothing unusual. Then December 14th. The entry was brief but strange. Severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Wind steady all day. Feel very anxious. This was concerning. Not the report of severe winds that was common in December in the Outer Hebrides, but the tone. Feel very anxious. Lighthouse keepers didn't typically record their emotional states. They recorded facts. Observations. Not feelings. December 15th. The entry was even stranger. Storm still raging. Wind steady. Stormbound. Cannot go out. Ship passing sounding foghorn. Could see lights of cabins. Ducket irritable. And then, added later in different handwriting. 12 noon. Gray daylight. Me, Ducket, and Marshall all prayed. The entry ended there. No further notation. No closing signature. Nothing for December 16th or any day after. Moore read it again. All prayed. 3 experienced keepers, men who dealt with Atlantic storms regularly, had felt compelled to pray together. What had frightened them so badly? And December 15th was the same day the Archtor had passed and noted the lighthouse was dark. Which meant, what? That the keepers had extinguished the light because of the storm? Oh. Or that they were already gone by then? Moore and the crewmen went back outside to check the rest of the station. They needed to see if the keepers had been working outside. If there was evidence of what had happened. The west landing area, the main access point where the Hesperus had docked, looked normal. No damage. No signs of disturbance. But the east landing, on the opposite side of the island, was different. The east landing was more exposed to the Atlantic. It was rarely used because of how rough the seas could be on that side. But there was a storage area there for equipment, and a set of iron railings bolted to the rock to help keepers navigate in rough weather. When Moore and the crew reached the east landing, they found damage. A section of the iron railing had been torn away. Not rusted through. Not gradually deteriorated. Torn away. The metal was twisted. The bolts that had secured it to the rock had been ripped out. A storage box, bolted to the rock face 110 feet above sea level, had been completely destroyed. The box itself was gone. The bolts were there, but whatever had been in the box was scattered or swept away. On the cliff face, 70 feet above the landing, there was a patch of turf that had been torn away. A scar on the rock where earth and grass had been ripped off by some force. Moore looked at this damage and tried to make sense of it. A wave? Could a wave reach 110 feet above sea level and destroy a bolted storage box? Could a wave tear iron railings from solid rock? In extreme conditions, yes. Waves in the North Atlantic during winter storms could be massive. There were documented cases of waves reaching extraordinary heights. But 110 feet? And if a wave that powerful had struck the east side, why was the rest of the lighthouse compound undamaged? Why was the lighthouse itself, though tall, completely intact? Why was the west landing area unmarked? Moore returned to the lighthouse. He needed to check something. Each keeper had a set of oilskins. Heavy waterproof coats and trousers worn when working outside in bad weather. They were essential equipment. Keepers never went out in rain or spray without them. Moore checked the peg where the oilskins hung. 2 sets were missing. Ducats and Marshalls. This made sense. If they'd gone outside to check on something, they'd have worn their oilskins. But MacArthur's oilskins were still hanging on the peg. His coat was there. His heavy weather gear. Unused. This created a puzzle. If all 3 men had gone outside, why hadn't MacArthur taken his oilskins? If only 2 had gone out, why hadn't the 3rd stayed behind in the lighthouse? Moore thought through the possibilities. Ducat and Marshall went outside. MacArthur stayed inside. Then something happened to the 2 outside, and MacArthur went out after them, but in such a hurry he didn't take his oilskins? In a storm severe enough to tear iron railings from rock? That didn't make sense. No experienced keeper would rush out into a deadly storm without weather gear. It was suicide. Unless MacArthur hadn't gone out voluntarily. Unless something had compelled him. Unless there was some emergency so urgent that taking 30 seconds to grab his coat was impossible. But what emergency? What could be so urgent that you'd run into a winter Atlantic storm without protection? Moore checked the signal system. When keepers went out to work, particularly to the remote parts of the island, they had a protocol. If they were going to be away from the lighthouse for any length of time, they'd set signal flags to let passing ships know the station was temporarily unattended. No signal flags had been set. None were missing from storage. This suggested the keepers either didn't intend to be gone long, or whatever happened occurred so suddenly they had no time to follow protocol. Moore also checked the lighthouse light itself. The lamp was maintained. Clean. Ready to operate. The fuel reservoir was full. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the light was wound and functional. But the light hadn't been operating. The Archtor had seen it dark on December 15th. And it was still dark when the Hesperus arrived on December 20th. This meant that for at least 5 days, possibly more, the light had not been lit. 3 experienced keepers would never let the light go dark for that long. It was the most fundamental duty. No matter what else was happening, you lit the lamp. Unless all 3 were incapable. Unless all 3 were gone. Moore and the crew searched the island for hours. They found no bodies. No signs of the keepers. No further evidence of what had happened. Finally, Moore returned to the Hesperus. He had to report what he'd found. Captain Harvey needed to send word to the Northern Lighthouse Board. They sailed back to the Isle of Lewis. From there, a telegram was sent to the mainland. The message was brief and factual. A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall and Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Entrance door closed. Rising sun door fastened. Beds empty. Clock stopped. Fire out. Provisions left. The men are nowhere to be found. The telegram went on to describe the damaged railings and the missing oilskins. It concluded, I am of the opinion that they have been washed away by the storm. I have made a full report to the superintendent. Captain Harvey's opinion, that the keepers were washed away by a wave. It was the most logical explanation given the evidence. The damaged east landing. The missing oilskins on 2 of the 3 men. The severe storm that had been raging. But even as he wrote it, there were details that didn't fit. The clock stopped. The table set for a meal never eaten. The 3rd man without his oilskins. The strange entries in the logbook about praying together. And most troubling, the complete absence of bodies. The sea could wash men away. But 3 men? All at once? With no trace left behind? The telegram reached Edinburgh. The Northern Lighthouse Board immediately dispatched investigators. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent who had overseen the lighthouse construction, would lead the investigation. He would go to Flannan Isles himself and examine everything. The newspapers got hold of the story within days. 3 keepers vanish from remote lighthouse. Mystery at Flannan Isles. Strange disappearance in the Hebrides. The public was fascinated. And as the details emerged, as the investigation proceeded, the mystery would only deepen. Because what Muirhead would discover on his investigation would add new questions. New strange details. New possibilities. And over the following weeks and months, theories would emerge. Some rational. Some fantastic. Some based on evidence. Some based on imagination. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. December 29, 1900. Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, arrived at Flannan Isles aboard the lighthouse tender Hesperus. He brought with him a team of investigators and a replacement crew to staff the lighthouse. Muirhead had supervised the construction of this lighthouse. He knew every detail of its design. He understood the challenges of the location. And he was determined to find out what had happened to the 3 missing keepers. The weather had improved slightly, allowing safe landing. Muirhead and his team climbed the path to the lighthouse compound. Joseph Moore accompanied them, ready to show them what he'd found 9 days earlier. Muirhead's investigation would be thorough. He would examine everything. Measure everything. Document everything. His official report would become the primary source for all future understanding of the mystery. Muirhead began inside the lighthouse. He moved through each room systematically, noting every detail. The entrance hall. Clean and orderly. The keeper's duty coat was hanging on its usual peg. Boots were lined up neatly. Everything suggested the keepers had been maintaining normal routine. The kitchen. Muirhead examined the table more closely. It was set for a meal, but not completely. Only 2 places had been set, not 3. Plates, utensils, cups at 2 positions. The 3rd place was empty. This was odd. If the keepers were about to eat together, why were only 2 places set? Had the 3rd keeper already eaten? Was he on duty and would eat later? Or had something interrupted the meal preparation before the 3rd place could be set? On the counter, Muirhead found the remains of a meal under a cloth. Cold and untouched. Bread. Some cheese. Simple fare, but adequate. It had been sitting there for at least 2 weeks, maybe more. The clock had stopped at 8:45. Morning or evening? Impossible to tell. The clock wasn't wound, suggesting the keepers had been gone for long enough that it ran down naturally. In the sleeping quarters, Muirhead noted the unmade bed. The other 2 beds were made with military precision, the way experienced keepers always kept their quarters. But one bed was disturbed. Blankets thrown back. Pillow displaced. As if someone had gotten up quickly, perhaps in the middle of the night. Muirhead sat down with the logbook. He read through the entries carefully, comparing them to weather records from other stations in the area. The entries up to December 13th were completely normal. Standard weather observations. Routine maintenance notes. The handwriting was neat and consistent. No signs of distress or unusual circumstances. December 14th, severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Muirhead cross-referenced this with weather data. December 14th had been stormy, yes. But not unusually so for the region in December. Other lighthouses reported typical winter conditions. Strong winds, but nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would shock a keeper with 20 years of experience. Why had the keeper at Flannan described it as unprecedented? Had the island experienced a localized weather event? Or was something else happening that made the keeper perceive the storm as more severe than it actually was? December 15th, storm still raging. Wind steady. Storm-bound. Cannot go out. Again, weather records showed December 15th was actually calmer than the 14th. The storm was diminishing, not increasing. Yet the logbook described being storm-bound. And then the addition, me, Duckett, and Marshall all prayed. Muirhead studied the handwriting. The first part of the December 15th entry was in one keeper's writing. The addition about praying was in different handwriting. 2 different keepers had made entries that day. Both felt compelled to record their emotional state and their prayers. This was highly unusual. In decades of lighthouse records, Muirhead had rarely seen keepers record feelings or religious activities. They recorded facts. Weather. Maintenance. Ship sightings. Not prayers. What had frightened them so badly? Muirhead moved outside to examine the damaged areas. He brought measuring equipment and made careful notes. The west landing, where vessels normally docked, showed no damage at all. The railings were intact. The landing platform was undisturbed. Everything was as it had been during construction. The east landing was different. Muirhead examined the torn railing carefully. The iron posts had been 3 inches thick, set into the rock with heavy bolts. This wasn't decorative railing. This was industrial-strength equipment designed to withstand the worst the Atlantic could throw at it. 3 sections of railing, totaling about 70 feet, had been destroyed. Not corroded. Not gradually worn away. Torn out. The metal was twisted and bent. Some pieces were missing entirely, presumably swept into the sea. The storage box that had been mounted 110 feet above sea level was completely gone. Only the bolt holes remained. The box had been made of wood and iron, securely attached to rock. Something had ripped it away. Muirhead climbed up to examine the damaged area of turf. A section of earth and grass about 20 feet across had been torn from the cliff face. The rock underneath was exposed and scarred. The turf was nowhere to be found. He stood there, looking at the damage, doing calculations in his head. For a wave to reach 110 feet above sea level, it would need to be massive. Not impossible, but extremely rare. And for such a wave to strike while causing no damage to the rest of the station? The geometry didn't quite work. The lighthouse itself was taller than the damaged areas and showed no impact at all. If a wave had struck with enough force to destroy iron railings and rip away turf, surely the lighthouse would show some effect? Muirhead and his team searched the entire island. They examined every rock pool, every crevice, every possible location where bodies might have washed up or been caught. They found nothing. No bodies. No clothing. No personal items. No rope. No tools that the keepers might have been carrying. Nothing. The sea could certainly carry bodies away. But 3 men? All at once? Without leaving any trace on the rocks? Without any evidence of their presence at the scene? Muirhead considered the possibilities. If the 3 keepers had all been at the east landing when a massive wave struck, they could have been swept away together. But why would all 3 be there? Standard procedure was for one keeper to remain in the lighthouse at all times. Someone had to tend the light. Perhaps two had been at the landing and the third went down to help when something went wrong? But then why didn't he take his oilskins? The evidence showed MacArthur's weather gear was still hanging in the lighthouse. And why were they at the east landing at all? It was rarely used because of how exposed it was. The west landing was safer and more practical for most purposes. Muirhead compiled his findings into a detailed report. He included measurements, observations, timeline reconstructions, and his professional assessment. His conclusion was that the keepers had been swept away by a massive wave or series of waves during the storm. The evidence suggested the following sequence. On December 14th or 15th, during the severe storm, Duckett and Marshall went down to the east landing to secure equipment or check for damage. Both wore their oilskins because of the weather conditions. While they were there, a massive wave struck. The wave destroyed the railings and storage box and swept both men into the sea. MacArthur, inside the lighthouse, either saw what happened or realized the other two hadn't returned. He rushed down to help, moving so quickly he didn't take his oilskins. Perhaps he thought he could reach them in time. Perhaps he saw them in the water and acted without thinking. Another wave struck, or he ventured too close to the edge trying to help, and he too was swept away. All three bodies were carried out to sea by the storm surge and never recovered. This explanation accounted for most of the evidence. The damaged landing. The missing oilskins on two keepers. The absence of bodies. It was rational, based on known phenomena, and required no supernatural elements. Muirhead noted in his report that while this scenario was his best assessment, certain details remained unexplained. The logbook entries about the severity of the storm. The prayers. The stopped clock. The meal preparation interrupted. But these could be attributed to the stress of the situation, to the keeper's heightened anxiety about the storm, to routine activities abandoned when crisis struck. Muirhead's report was submitted to the Northern Lighthouse Board and accepted as the official explanation. The board ruled the deaths accidental. Swept away by a wave during a storm. A tragic but comprehensible maritime accident. The families of the three keepers received compensation. The lighthouse was restaffed with a new crew. Operations resumed. But the public wasn't satisfied with this explanation. The mystery had captured imaginations. Newspapers continued to speculate. Letters to editors proposed alternative theories. The story grew in the telling. Because despite Muirhead's thorough investigation and reasonable conclusions, there were details that nagged. Questions that wouldn't quite go away. Odd elements that didn't fit neatly into the wave theory. And over the years, as the story passed into legend, those odd details would be amplified. Embellished. Transformed. Until the mystery of Flannan Isles became less about what actually happened and more about what might have happened. Muirhead's wave theory was logical. It accounted for the damaged landing, the missing men, the absence of bodies. It was the most reasonable explanation given the evidence. But it had problems. Details that didn't quite fit. Questions it couldn't fully answer. Let's examine them one by one. First, the weather records. Muirhead noted in his report that the storm on December 14th and 15th was severe. But weather data from other stations in the Hebrides showed something different. The storm was strong, yes, but not exceptional. Not the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. The keeper who wrote that entry, almost certainly James Duckett based on the handwriting, had 20 years of lighthouse experience. He'd served at multiple stations. He'd weathered countless Atlantic storms. What about this particular storm frightened him so much? Other lighthouses reported rough but manageable conditions. No extraordinary wave heights. No unusual damage. Just typical December weather in the Hebrides. Was Flannan Isles experiencing localized conditions? Or was something else affecting the keeper's perception? The timeline creates difficulties. The arch tour passed on December 15th and noted the lighthouse was dark. This suggests the keepers were already gone, or at least unable to tend the light. But the logbook entry for December 15th exists. Someone made that entry. Someone wrote, "All prayed," on the afternoon of the 15th. If the keepers were swept away on the 15th, it must have been after that log entry. Afternoon or evening of the 15th at the earliest. But the storm was diminishing on the 15th, not intensifying. Weather records show the worst of the storm was actually on the 13th and early 14th. By the 15th, conditions were improving. So if the keepers were swept away by a wave, it happened during the calming phase of the storm, not during its peak. Possible, certainly. Freak waves can occur in any conditions. But it's another detail that doesn't quite fit. And the clock stopped at 8:45. Morning or evening? If evening, that's roughly sunset in December. If morning, that's after dawn. Either way, it suggests the keepers were still in the lighthouse at least until 8:45 on some day after the 15th. The clock needed time to wind down after they stopped maintaining it. The missing oilskins are the most troubling detail. Duckett's and Marshall's oilskins were gone. MacArthur's remained hanging in the lighthouse. Muirhead's theory requires MacArthur to have rushed out without his weather gear to help the other two. But MacArthur was an experienced keeper. Not as experienced as Duckett, but he'd worked in lighthouses for years. He understood the ocean. He understood storms. He would have known that running out into rough seas without protection was suicide. Even if he saw the other two in danger, even if he was desperate to help, taking 30 seconds to grab his oilskins would have been automatic. Instinctive. The kind of thing you do without conscious thought after years of training. Unless there was literally no time. Unless the situation was so immediate, so urgent, that those 30 seconds would mean the difference between life and death for the others. But if that were the case, what could MacArthur have done anyway? If a wave powerful enough to sweep away two experienced keepers had just struck, rushing out to help would accomplish nothing. He'd just be swept away too, which is presumably what happened if the wave theory is correct. It suggests panic. Irrational action. But lighthouse keepers were selected specifically for their ability to remain calm under pressure. Panic wasn't in their nature. Why were they at the East Landing at all? The East Landing was rarely used. It was more exposed than the West Landing. More dangerous in rough weather. Keepers avoided it when possible. What would draw them there during a storm? Muirhead suggested they were checking equipment or securing something. But what equipment was at the East Landing that required attention during a storm? The main equipment, the important supplies, were all on the west side or in the lighthouse itself. The storage box that was destroyed was mounted 110 feet above sea level specifically because it was considered safe from wave damage. It contained emergency supplies, backup equipment. Things you wouldn't need to check during a storm. Things that were positioned to be inaccessible during rough weather. And if they were checking the East Landing, why both Duckett and Marshall? Standard procedure, especially during storms, was for one keeper to remain in the lighthouse. The light had to be maintained. Someone had to be ready to record weather observations, to respond to signals, to maintain the station. Sending two keepers to the East Landing during a storm violated basic lighthouse protocol. In the weeks and months after the disappearance, alternative theories began to emerge. Some were rational attempts to account for the evidence. Others were more speculative. One early theory suggested an accident unrelated to waves. Perhaps one keeper fell from the cliff while working. The other went to help and also fell. The third rushed out and met the same fate. 3 separate accidents in sequence. This would explain why they were at the East Landing, investigating something one of them saw. It would explain the missing oilskins on 2 but not the third. It would explain the absence of bodies if they fell into deep water and were carried away by currents. But it had problems too. 3 experienced, careful men all falling from the same location? And why didn't the first who fell call out a warning? Why would the others approach the same dangerous spot? Another theory proposed that the keepers had seen a ship in distress. Perhaps they took the station's boat to attempt a rescue and were caught by waves. The boat would have been destroyed, taking the men with it. But the station's boat was still there. Still tied at the West Landing. Undamaged. A third theory suggested that one keeper went mad. That he attacked the others, perhaps killed them, then either killed himself or threw himself into the sea. The distressed logbook entries could be early signs of mental instability. But this didn't fit the evidence either. There were no signs of violence in the lighthouse. No blood. No damage. No indication of struggle. And if one keeper had gone violently mad, wouldn't the others have noted it in the log? Wouldn't there be some warning signs? As the story spread through newspapers and popular culture, more exotic theories emerged. Some pointed to the old legends. The Flannan Isles were sacred. Supernatural forces protected them. Building the lighthouse had angered something that had now taken revenge. Others suggested alien abduction. Though this was 1900, before modern UFO mythology, the idea that the keepers had been taken by unknown forces had appealed to certain audiences. Sea monsters were proposed. Giant waves, yes, but waves created by some creature surfacing near the island. The keepers had seen it, been terrified by it, fled to the East Landing, and been taken. These supernatural theories gained traction partly because of the logbook entries. All prayed. That phrase suggested terror beyond normal storm anxiety. It suggested the keepers had seen or experienced something that drove them to their knees in supplication. But Muirhead's investigation found no evidence of anything supernatural. No strange tracks. No unusual marks. Nothing that suggested anything beyond a natural disaster. The supernatural theories persist not because of evidence, but because the mystery has gaps. Because the rational explanation doesn't quite satisfy. Because humans prefer mysterious disappearances to have mysterious causes. Over the next century, the Flannan Isles mystery would be examined and re-examined. Researchers would pore over the evidence. New theories would be proposed. The story would be adapted into poems, songs, films, books. And with each retelling, new details would be added. Some accurate. Some embellished. Some entirely invented. The line between historical fact and dramatic fiction would blur. In the next segment, we'll separate fact from fiction. We'll look at what we actually know versus what has been added to the story over time. We'll examine how this mystery grew from a maritime accident into a legend. And we'll consider what really might have happened, based on the actual evidence, stripped of embellishment and speculation. Over the past 120 years, the Flannan Isles mystery has been retold countless times. With each retelling, details have shifted. Been added. Been altered. Until the story most people know today contains elements that never appeared in the original reports. Let's separate what we know from what's been added. We know, from Muirhead's report and Joseph Moore's testimony, that the lighthouse was empty when discovered on December 20th, 1900. 3 keepers were missing. The light had been dark for at least 5 days. Damage was found at the east landing. 2 sets of oilskins were missing. The logbook contained entries up to December 15th, including the phrase, "all prayed." These are documented facts. Recorded at the time. Verified by multiple witnesses. This is the foundation of the mystery. Now let's look at what's been added. One of the most persistent additions to the story is the overturned chair. In many retellings, Joseph Moore enters the lighthouse and finds a chair knocked over in the kitchen. This becomes evidence of sudden panic, of the keepers fleeing in terror, of something so shocking it made them abandon their meal and rush out. But the overturned chair doesn't appear in any contemporary account. Not in Moore's testimony. Not in Muirhead's report. Not in any newspaper article from 1900 or 1901. The overturned chair first appears in a 1929 article in a Scottish newspaper. Nearly 30 years after the event. It was added for dramatic effect, and it stuck. Now it's repeated in almost every retelling. It's fiction. A detail invented to make the story more dramatic. Similarly, many accounts describe the table as if a meal had been interrupted mid-bite. Food on plates. Utensils dropped. As if the keepers had been eating and suddenly fled. The actual evidence was more mundane. The table was set for a meal. Food was prepared but not served. Nothing suggested anyone had been eating. It suggested meal preparation was interrupted, not the meal itself. But interrupted mid-meal sounds more dramatic than interrupted during preparation. So that's what stuck in popular retellings. The logbook entries have also been heavily embellished over time. The actual entries for December 14th and 15th are brief. Severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Wind steady all day. Feel very anxious. And storm still raging. Wind steady. Stormbound. Cannot go out. Ship passing sounding foghorn. Could see lights of cabins. Ducket irritable. Followed by 12 noon. Gray daylight. Me, Ducket, and Marshall all prayed. These entries are strange, yes. The emotional content is unusual for lighthouse logs. But they're not incoherent. They're not raving. They're just anxious. However, in many later retellings, the logbook entries become increasingly dramatic. Some versions claim the keepers wrote about strange lights in the sky. Others say they described feelings of being watched or voices in the storm. None of this is in the actual logbook. These are embellishments added decades later to make the story more mysterious. The most extreme embellishment claims the logbook contained entries describing the keepers praying for days, becoming increasingly terrified, with the final entry being something like, "God help us all," or "The storm has taken them." Dramatic, yes. But completely invented. The last entry simply notes they prayed at noon on December 15th. Nothing about terror. Nothing about God helping them. Just a simple statement that they prayed. In 1912, poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem called Flannan Isles. It's a ballad-style narrative told from the perspective of a sailor arriving at the lighthouse and discovering the keepers gone. The poem is powerful. Atmospheric. It captures the eeriness of the empty lighthouse beautifully. And it includes the detail of an overturned chair, untouched food, and an atmosphere of supernatural dread. Gibson's poem wasn't meant as historical record. It was artistic interpretation. But it became incredibly influential. Many people's understanding of the Flannan Isles mystery comes more from Gibson's poem than from the actual historical record. The poem ends with the sailor and his companions fleeing the island in terror, convinced something supernatural took the keepers. This ending, dramatic and effective as poetry, has colored public perception of the case for over a century. But Gibson wasn't there. He never visited Flannan Isles. He never saw the lighthouse or read the official reports. He created a work of art based on newspaper accounts and his imagination. The problem is that his artistic additions have become, in popular memory, part of the facts of the case. The mystery has been adapted numerous times for film, television, and radio. Each adaptation adds its own embellishments. A 1977 television drama suggested the keepers had found something in the sea. A mysterious object that drove them mad or summoned something terrible. Pure fiction, but presented with enough documentary-style realism that some viewers believed it was based on new evidence. A 2018 film, The Vanishing, proposed that the keepers found a chest of gold washed ashore, which led to conflict, murder, and madness. Well-acted and atmospheric, but entirely fictional. Yet reviews and discussions of the film often blur the line between its fictional narrative and the historical case. Doctor Who did an episode loosely based on the mystery, involving alien birds that could erase people from existence. Entertaining science fiction, but it further embedded the Flannan Isles name in popular culture with completely invented details. Each adaptation takes the basic framework, 3 keepers, remote lighthouse, mysterious disappearance, and builds a dramatic narrative around it. These narratives are compelling. They're more satisfying than probably swept away by a wave. And they stick in memory. The result is that most people's knowledge of Flannan Isles is a mixture of historical fact, Gibson's poem, various film and TV adaptations, and internet speculation. The actual case has been buried under layers of fiction. So let's strip away the embellishments and focus on documented facts. On or before December 15, 1900, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers disappeared from Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Their disappearance occurred during or shortly after a winter storm. Damage was found at the east landing, including destroyed iron railings and a missing storage box. The damage was consistent with extreme wave action, though unusually high above sea level. 2 of the 3 keepers had taken their oilskins. The 3rd had not. The lighthouse was undamaged. The living quarters were orderly. A meal was in preparation but not completed. The lighthouse lamp had not been operating for at least 5 days. The logbook contained entries through December 15 that were unusual in tone but not incoherent. The keepers expressed anxiety about the storm and noted that they prayed together. No bodies were ever found. No additional evidence emerged despite thorough searches. That's it. That's what we know with certainty. Everything else, the overturned chair, the dramatic logbook entries, the supernatural elements, the elaborate theories, is speculation, embellishment, or fiction. Why has this case captured imagination so powerfully? Why does it persist when countless other maritime accidents have been forgotten? Part of it is the location. The remote lighthouse. The isolated island. The hostile ocean. It's inherently dramatic. It feels like the setting for a mystery. Part of it is the completeness of the disappearance. 3 men. Gone. No bodies. No definitive explanation. Just an empty lighthouse and questions. And part of it is the logbook. Those brief entries suggesting fear and prayer. They hint at something beyond ordinary experience. They suggest the keepers knew something was wrong before they disappeared. But mostly, the mystery persists because we want it to. Because swept away by a freak wave is disappointing. Because we prefer our mysteries unsolved. Because the unknown is more compelling than the known. The truth is probably mundane. A tragic accident. Men in the wrong place at the wrong time. The ocean taking what the ocean takes. But the legend is better. And legends survive while facts fade. In the century since the Flannan Isles disappearance, our understanding of ocean waves has advanced considerably. Oceanographers now recognize phenomena that weren't understood in 1900. Rogue waves. Also called freak waves or monster waves. These are waves that appear suddenly, often in relatively calm seas, rising to heights far exceeding the surrounding wave patterns. For decades, rogue waves were considered maritime legend. Sailors reported encountering walls of water that appeared from nowhere, waves twice the height of surrounding seas. Scientists dismissed these reports as exaggeration. But satellite data and modern instrumentation have confirmed they are real. Rogue waves occur more frequently than previously thought. They can reach extraordinary heights. And they can strike with devastating force even when overall sea conditions aren't particularly severe. A rogue wave can be created by multiple smaller waves coinciding at the same point. The waves combine, amplify, creating a single massive surge that exists for only seconds before dispersing. It rises. It strikes. It's gone. This phenomenon could explain the Flannan Isles damage. A rogue wave striking the east landing could reach 110 feet above sea level. It could destroy iron railings. It could sweep away men before they had time to react. And it could occur during a storm that wasn't particularly exceptional by Hebridean standards. Based on modern understanding and the actual evidence, here's what probably happened. On December 14th or 15th, during the storm, something at the east landing required attention. Perhaps equipment had broken loose. Perhaps the keepers noticed damage forming. Perhaps they saw something concerning and went to investigate. Duckett and Marshall went down, properly equipped with oilskins. They were assessing the situation. Checking the railings. Looking at the storage box. While they were there, a rogue wave struck. It rose suddenly from the storm-tossed sea. It reached heights far above normal wave action. It hit the landing with tremendous force. The wave destroyed the railings. It tore away the storage box. It ripped turf from the cliff face. And it swept Duckett and Marshall into the sea before they could react. Men weighing 150 to 200 pounds are nothing to a wave carrying thousands of tons of water. MacArthur, in the Lighthouse, either saw this happen or realized something was wrong when the other two didn't return. He rushed down the path to the east landing. Perhaps he saw them in the water. Perhaps he thought he could help. Perhaps he was simply trying to understand what had happened. He moved quickly. Too quickly to grab his oilskins. Because he could see the situation was urgent. Because he was focused on reaching the landing. Because he wasn't thinking about his own safety. When he reached the landing, another wave struck. Or he ventured too close to the edge. Or he slipped on wet rock. And he too was swept away. 3 men gone in minutes. Their bodies carried out to sea by storm surge and currents. No trace left behind except damaged railings and an empty lighthouse. What about the strange logbook entries? The anxiety about the storm? The prayers? Consider the psychology of isolation. 3 men alone on a rock in the Atlantic. 20 miles from land. Winter setting in. Storms becoming more frequent and severe. The lighthouse had only been operational for a year. The keepers were still adjusting to the particular character of Flannan Isles. Every lighthouse is different. Every location has its own patterns, its own challenges. Perhaps this storm, while not objectively worse than others in the region, felt worse at Flannan. Perhaps the wind created unusual sounds in the lighthouse structure. Perhaps the waves struck the rock in ways that shook the building. Perhaps the isolation and darkness amplified their anxiety. Severe winds the likes of which I have never seen might not be objective measurement. It might be subjective experience. It might be the feeling of the storm rather than its actual magnitude. And praying together? 3 men, isolated, anxious, facing natural forces that could kill them. Turning to prayer isn't mysterious. It's human. It's what people do when they feel powerless and afraid. The logbook entries don't require supernatural explanation. They just require understanding that the keepers were human. That they felt fear. That they sought comfort. That they were vulnerable despite their experience and training. It's easy to focus on the mystery and forget the victims. 3 real men died. They had families. Lives. Futures that were cut short. James Duckett left behind a wife and 4 children. He was 43 years old. He'd spent decades keeping lights burning, keeping sailors safe. He died doing that work. Thomas Marshall was 28. Young. His whole life ahead of him. He'd chosen a dangerous profession and paid the ultimate price. William MacArthur was 40. He'd taken a replacement position at the last minute. A routine assignment that turned fatal. Their families received compensation from the Northern Lighthouse Board. But no amount of money replaces a husband, a father, a son. These women and children lived the rest of their lives with the loss and with the mystery of not knowing exactly what happened. The other lighthouse keepers, the men who worked at Flannan after the disappearance, lived with the knowledge of what could happen. Every storm reminded them. Every time they went out to check equipment in rough weather, they thought about Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur. Joseph Moore, who discovered the empty lighthouse, was reportedly haunted by it. He continued working as a lighthouse keeper, but the memory stayed with him. The empty rooms. The stopped clock. The absence where 3 men should have been. The Flannan Isles mystery persists not because it's unsolvable. It persists because the solution is unsatisfying. Swept away by a wave doesn't feel like enough. It doesn't match the dramatic setting. It doesn't account for our need for narrative closure. It doesn't provide the explanation we want. We want the mystery to be mysterious. We want supernatural forces or elaborate conspiracies or undiscovered evidence. We want something that matches the eerie atmosphere of the story. But sometimes the truth is simple. Sometimes men die in accidents. Sometimes the ocean takes without explanation or warning. Sometimes there's no hidden meaning, no deeper truth. Just tragedy and loss. The Flannan Isles case teaches us about how myths are built. How small details get amplified. How gaps in evidence become spaces for imagination. How a straightforward maritime accident becomes a legend. It also teaches us about the power of place. That remote lighthouse on its lonely island. The setting does half the work. If the same disappearance had occurred at a harbor lighthouse near a city, it would have been forgotten. But Flannan? Remote, forbidding, legendary? That setting makes the story unforgettable. So what really happened at Flannan Isles Lighthouse in December 1900? Based on evidence, modern understanding of ocean phenomena, and rational analysis, 3 keepers were swept away by waves while checking damage at the East Landing during a storm. It was quick. It was unexpected. It was fatal. But based on legend, embellishment, and over a century of storytelling, three keepers vanished mysteriously from a lighthouse, leaving behind cryptic logbook entries and an atmosphere of supernatural dread. Both versions exist. The historical truth and the legendary mystery. And both have their place. The historical truth reminds us that the sea is dangerous. That nature is powerful. That even experienced, careful, well-trained people can die in accidents. It's a sobering reminder of human vulnerability. The legendary mystery reminds us that we're still storytelling creatures. That we need narratives that match our emotional sense of the world. That we find meaning in ambiguity and possibility in gaps. You can choose which version you prefer. The probable truth or the compelling mystery. The rational explanation or the enduring enigma. Either way, remember James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and William MacArthur. 3 men who went to a remote island to keep a light burning. Who did their duty until the ocean took them. Who deserve to be remembered not just as a mystery, but as people. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Flannan Isles. For exploring the mystery, examining the evidence, and thinking about how stories evolve. The lighthouse still stands. It was automated in 1971 and unmanned since then. The islands remain as remote and forbidding as ever. The Atlantic still pounds those rocks. The wind still howls across that barren landscape. And somewhere out there, in the cold waters west of Scotland, 3 keepers rest. Their story told and retold. Their mystery unsolved in legend, even if solved in Act, rest well. Dream of lighthouses and storms. Of mysteries and truths. Of the line between what we know and what we imagine. Sweet dreams and good night.